Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to this week's episode. So we've come to the end of Pierre's 8 sessions, and wow, from my perspective, what a journey he's been on. And he's had so much courage in not just doing the work, but of course, being brave enough to share that work with all of us. And I really hope that his episodes have touched and impacted you in some way in your own life. I'm mindful that a lot happens in eight sessions, and there's a lot of themes, there are sub-themes, and I think sometimes as a viewer it may be tricky to go, well, what do I take away from this? What can I reflect on in my own life? And so in this week's episode, what I wanted to do was to bring out what I think are 4 of the key themes within Pierre sessions. And I think they're themes that are relevant to all of us in our own healing journeys. And hopefully also will then give you some places to dig deeper in your own journey and reflections. Remember also that we have bonus videos and worksheets to accompany each episode. That's another great way to go deeper into your own reflections. You can find all of those for Pierre and Haley sessions at intherapy.alexhoward.com. I also want to say at this point that I think we're all super curious as to how things unfold for Pierre in the coming weeks and months and ultimately years. And we will follow up with him in the future. We'll also follow up with Haley at some point in the future as well, so we can continue together to follow their journeys. Number 1, understanding your past is great, and it's not enough. Where does it feel for you that you're kind of working edges?
Well, I feel like I know the theory.
Yes.
Or, I can understand what happened, how it's affecting me, blah, blah, blah. But then how do I move on?
Yeah.
Really, that's the thing.
Pierre came into the series with a really good understanding of the events of his past and how those events had shaped and impacted him in his life now. And he and I did spend a fair bit of time kind of finessing and refining that understanding and really supporting him in challenging some of the limitations that had come from that understanding. But as I said to Pierre a number of times in the episodes, it's great to have that knowledge, but that awareness alone is the beginning of the healing. It's not the end of the healing. That if we just understand how we've been shaped and impacted, we're still being shaped and impacted in those ways. And to change and to heal those impacts, we need to do a few things. Firstly, we need to learn to unhook ourselves and our lives now from the past. And so not just seeing how we can be shaped and impacted, but consciously choosing to do things differently in our lives now. It's also sometimes what's happening is the intellectual understanding of what happened is almost like a protective place, like a safe place that we can go to our mind about our experiences as a way of avoiding being in our hearts and being in our bodies from the experiences that have happened. And so one has to be careful to not use the intellectual and the logical understanding as a way of avoiding actually going into and healing and metabolizing and processing the emotions. And that's why you saw in some of the earlier episodes with Pierre, my continual invitations to him to how he felt and really guiding and supporting him in to that place of feeling. I also think it's important to recognize that sometimes what can happen is that in the place of understanding, we can have logical empathy and compassion for our primary caregivers, which is often our parents or grandparents. And it's not that empathy or compassion is wrong, but it's sometimes a way of almost gaslighting our own experience, like not allowing us to have the emotions of the rage and the anger and the hurt and the sadness and the longing and all of that stuff that may also be there. It's like we're robbing ourselves of the chance of having the feelings because we're explaining them away, we're intellectualizing them away. And so to move from just understanding to actually doing our healing work, often we have to hold two truths. The truth of the understanding of the logic, but also the truth of the felt sense, which by definition may be irrational or illogical, but it's true. And it's how we actually felt in our heart center. And we need to allow ourselves to feel and to process that as well. And so to summarize, understanding your past, it's great, it's important, and it can sometimes be a hiding place, and ultimately it's not enough. We have to then move into our heart and our body and the felt centers to process and metabolize those experiences. Number 2, we normalize to disconnection.
I think it was around 4 years old when I realized that whatever was on TV got more attention than I did. So I thought, what if I did whatever I saw on TV? So in my head, I did everything, from athlete to actor to singer to whatever.
But in a sense, quite a lot of escapism,
Oh,
ways of just trying to put yourself somewhere else.
Yeah.
One of the ways that we learn to survive the traumatic and difficult experiences of childhood is we disconnect from our feelings and emotions. One of the ways that this presented for Pierre was going into fantasy. And so he would fantasize in his mind about how the world could be or should be, or how he wished it to be different. And he became very creative and very skillful at doing that. It's interesting that then in his life now, he's in a creative occupation. Like he trained that capacity. And that was a survival strategy that helped him not feel his feelings and emotions because they were overwhelming and there wasn't the holding and support that he needed to be able to feel them. So Pierre used fantasy to disconnect. He also used over-intellectualizing things to disconnect. And so whatever it is that we're doing, whatever strategy we use, that becomes a habit. And so we normalize to that as a way of relating to the world. So that becomes the strategy, the program through which we meet our life. We do it so much that like anything that becomes familiar, becomes normalized, it then becomes, in a sense, who we know ourselves as being. And so the challenge here is that we can have strategies that were survival strategies as children that were like protective walls that kept us safe. But the walls that kept us safe as children become the walls that imprison us as adults. And so the strategy that helped Pierre survive of disconnecting is now the challenge in his life that he's disconnected from, or he was disconnected from feelings and emotions and intimacy and relationships and the beauty and the magic of contact with ourselves and contact with other people. But because we normalize, we often don't realize the price that we're paying. All the different ways in Pierre's life that this has impacted him in terms of intimate relationships, his relationship with himself, his sense of being in touch with his real capacity in terms of his work life. And so we normalize to disconnection. We disconnect to survive, and that just becomes the way that we know ourselves, the way that we relate to the world. But it doesn't have to be that way. What was necessary to survive as a child is no longer necessary for us as an adult. And so if we can recognize that we're disconnecting, if we can recognize that we're normalizing to a way of being that may be familiar to us, but is not ultimately helpful or healthy, we can then work to change that. Number 3, meeting our 3 core emotional needs. There is a place inside of you that is longing for love, for attention, for interest, for care, for entering its world and wanting to really experience it and be with it. And what that looks like is opening to it. So going back to what I was just saying, to be able to let down the barriers or the walls that kept us safe but now are keeping us trapped, we have to go back to why we built those barriers in the first place. And so if we look at Pierre's story, the 3 core emotional needs of boundaries, safety, and love, he didn't have as a child that sense of safety, because the holding that he needed to teach his nervous system about co-regulation wasn't really there. And it was somewhat there with his grandmother, but then that was stripped away. And as he was moved to the Caribbean, he lost that sense of physical holding and safety. And then the core emotional need of love, which is an unconditional love for us as we are, not a love for what we do or what we achieve or whatever it may be. And also the boundaries to be able to say no or to say, yes, I want more, I don't want that not being respected. And so when these core emotional needs are not met as children, we then disconnect because we can't hold, we can't feel our emotions because we don't have the resources and the capacities to do that. And so we disconnect, as we talked about in the last theme around Pierre then going to fancy as a way to escape that. So to heal, we have to learn to meet those 3 core emotional needs for ourselves, because this is one of the gifts of being an adult. As children, we are dependent upon our caregivers to meet those needs for us. But as an adult, we can learn how to meet those core emotional needs for ourselves. Now, these are ultimately skills that we learn to do. Sometimes one of the unspoken impacts of good therapeutic work is having a clinician that helps us meet those needs by meeting them somewhat for us. And so you'll see in my work with Pierre that there's a real respecting of his yes and of his no, and finding edges, and yes, pushing him sometimes, but also really respecting those edges. My sense of welcoming and holding an invitation of his emotions is creating a sense of safety. And in a sense, my nervous system being regulated when some big emotions start to arise sends the message that he's safe. And then from a point of view of love, it's really respecting that client where they are, not just rewarding them for great insights, but really being interested and curious in their experience. So that's one way through therapeutic work that we can get a flavor of that. But ultimately, it's learning to meet those needs for ourselves. And you'll see a fair bit of that in my work with Pierre around encouraging, for example, meditation practice to help that self-regulation, working on the inner critic to work on that relationship with himself and that sense of loving and allowing of his experience as he is. And so this is the gift of being an adult. We can learn to meet these core emotional needs. And in doing that, we are then able to feel those feelings and emotions. It's like they're the ingredients that make that possible. It takes time, it takes practice. It's not something that just happens in 8 sessions. It's also why the homework is important, because what happens in 8 hours of therapy is not as important as what happens in the hundreds of hours between those sessions of someone learning these capacities and these skills. Number 4, focus on how you meet the world, not your outcomes in it. Because if your sense of self-worth and your sense of joy and your sense of goodness in your life is tied to the outcome, we can't have confidence that you could be sat here in 12 months' time and be in a good place. But if your sense of self-esteem and your happiness and your joy is unhooked from what happens, but it is tied into how you approach it, like you show up and you take risks and you calculate the risks, but you take risks, then your joy comes from the growth, not from the outcome. And we can guarantee growth, we just can't guarantee the outcome.
Yeah.
When our childhood taught us that how lovable we are, how safe we are, how respected our boundaries will be, is dependent upon what we do, what we don't do, what we achieve. Effectively, it's conditional based on certain things in our lives. We learn the same for how we then relate to the world. So we were related to in a conditional way, and so our relationship to ourselves becomes conditional. So that means we get very fixated on outcomes, that our sense of pride or self-worth or self-esteem is dependent upon achieving this thing in the future. The challenge is that in life we can put in all of the effort and we can be determined towards something, but it doesn't guarantee outcomes. And so we can do everything right, not get the outcome, and then not get the gift of that sense of progress and that sense of growth, that sense of growing our self-respect and self-worth. And so by focusing on the place from which we meet the world rather than the outcomes, it's like giving ourselves the unconditional love that we always long for. That we're showing up, we're doing the best that we can, and that is what we value ourselves for. And if we can focus on the journey and we can focus on the steps on the journey and bringing as much care and presence and attention as we can towards those steps, that's also more sustainable, which means that the outcome is actually more likely to happen, not less likely to happen. But whether it happens or not, we still are growing our relationship with ourselves. And this is a practice because, of course, our conditioning is towards the future and towards the outcome. So we have to practice catching that, recognizing that, and then bringing ourselves back to where am I right now? What's the next step? What's the next piece in front of me? And how do I show up to that with as much love and care and kindness and determination as I possibly can? And the more we practice that, as I say, the more ultimately the outcomes in our lives take care of themselves. So I'd love to hear your reflections on these 4 key themes, but also what you took away from sharing Pierre's sessions. If you have questions, please do ask them in the comments as well. And if you haven't already, please do sign up for the free bonus materials that accompany the series. You can visit intherapy.alexhoward.com. And I recorded a bonus video and wrote a worksheet to go with each of the sessions. And they're really designed to move from passively watching someone else's journey to bring those lessons alive in your own lived experience. Remember also, you can watch the entire season on YouTube, or you can listen to the entire season as a podcast. You can also watch or listen to Haley's episodes as well. And we've already started filming with our next brave new participant, and we're super excited to share those episodes with you in the future. In next week's episode, I'm going to be answering some of your questions. So we've been going through the comments on the videos on YouTube. We've pulled out some of the key questions in there, and I look forward to answering those in next week's episode. Thanks for watching.